This Georgia Department of Education screencast is intended to provide teachers of 5th grade social studies with content knowledge to aid in the teaching of the Georgia Standards of Excellence. Just as the repercussions of World War I directly contributed to World War II, the repercussions of World War II directly contributed to the Cold War. And so in this screencast, we will look at where things stood at the close of World War II, and how Eleanor Roosevelt sought to prevent the recurrence of another cataclysmic conflict with the formation of the United Nations. We will also look at how our uneasy alliance with Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union quickly devolved into a Cold War of policy rather than direct fighting, and how it was this very alliance between the communistic Soviets and our own capitalistic nation that resulted in Germany and Korea being split by the very allies that rescued them from German and Japanese control, and in the case of Korea resulted in a war that is still unresolved to this day. Students will also need some familiarity with what communism is and how the very nature of communism resulted in the Iron Curtain and our near brush with nuclear war when Nikita Khrushchev interfered in Cuba. Of course, no discussion of communism would be complete without a look at the rabid paranoia of Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars, and the League of Nations originally proposed by the United States was created to ensure that it was just that. The organization was to prevent future wars by giving nations a place to discuss and negotiate solutions to problems with other nations, as well as provide security for its member nations. But the United States never joined the League of Nations, because Congress felt membership would only serve to embroil us further in European conflicts. And while Congress was correct in predicting that the League would fail due to its lack of having any real power to enforce its decisions, not belonging to it certainly did not prevent our inclusion in World War II. It was in fact the onset of World War II that ended the League, as they had clearly failed in their primary objective of preventing another large-scale war. So at the end of World War II, nations were again looking for a way to prevent such devastation in the future, and the United Nations was born. This time, however, the U.S. would not only join, it would be one of the founding members and designers of its structure. President Roosevelt's wife and First Lady of our nation, Eleanor Roosevelt, was a First Lady unlike any other we had had before. Not satisfied to host teas and dinner parties, she took an active role in humanitarian issues, as well as equal rights for African Americans or blacks, and women. President Harry Truman appointed her as one of the first delegates to the United Nations, and she remained an active delegate for 7 years. Our standard asks us to discuss the origins of the Cold War, which were pretty much a direct result of having the communistic Soviet Union as our allies during World War II. As the U.S., France, and Great Britain beat back the German army and occupied Germany from the west, the Soviet Union did so from the east. When the war ended and it came time to re-establish the German government and economy, the Soviets wanted it to be communistic, and the United States wanted it to be capitalistic, and so that is how we ended up with a divided Germany and the city of Berlin in contention. The Soviets felt Berlin should be a part of Soviet-controlled communistic East Germany, but the United States and her other allies still controlled part of the city. In an attempt to get them out, the Soviets blockaded all railroads, roads, and waterways into the Allied part of the city, hoping to force them out. The Allies, countered by airlifting supplies past the blockade, dropping them in by parachute, making the Soviet blockade useless. Our own blockade, created in response to theirs, however, proved quite effective, and the Soviets, unable to do anything to stop the Berlin airlift, which was considered a humanitarian effort, not a military one, short of starting another war, gave up, and 2 weeks later the two occupied halves of Germany became separate states, one communistic and the other not. And Berlin was split along with them. In fact, Berlin would later become the one place where the Iron Curtain, the imaginary boundary that separated communistic countries from non-communistic countries, took a quite literal form by way of an actual wall that was built to separate communistic Berlin from the rest. It was the Soviet Union's brazen move to blockade Berlin, coupled with a few other incidents, that prompted the other Allied nations to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, as a means to protect non-communistic nations from the Soviet Union's attempt to establish communistic puppet regimes. The United States had learned with Hitler's Nazis that we could not simply stay out of European affairs, and that we, in fact, needed to have a stronger presence in Europe, and NATO was a part of that. Smaller, non-communistic nations could now look to the U.S. and her allies to protect them from being taken over by the powerful Soviet Union. Korea was liberated from Japan's control in the same way as Germany, in that the Soviet Union liberated North Korea and set up the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, a communistic state, and the other allies came in from the south and set up the Republic of Korea, with the boundary between the two being the 38th parallel, a line of latitude that became the border for the two states. Military conflict began when the Soviet-backed North Korean army crossed the 38th parallel in an attempt to establish a single communistic Korea. The United States quickly sent American soldiers to help the South Koreans. With both halves of Korea being backed by very powerful allies, yet neither willing to take steps that could lead to a larger world war, the conflict quickly came to a stalemate. After 3 years of fighting, with neither side really able to win without escalation, and huge casualties being incurred on both sides, an armistice, or ceasefire, was reached. Nothing was ever resolved. The two sides just agreed to stop fighting, and Korea remains divided. Our conflict in Vietnam also has its origins in the ending of World War II. However, in this case, when the occupying Japanese army withdrew and the previous French colonial government tried to reassert control, they were quickly overthrown in the north by the communistic Viet Cong. The French quickly scrambled to try to take Vietnam back and establish their territory in the south. The United States backed South Vietnam for some time, but the war was hugely unpopular in our country, as many saw it as just another Korea where we would continue to sacrifice American lives for a war we really couldn't win and had no real business being involved in anyway. When America pulled out, the Viet Cong quickly defeated the French and united Vietnam under a single communist regime. While our concerns about the Soviet Union and the forceful spread of communism following World War II were certainly justified to a point, concern eventually turned to paranoia, and U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy thrived on that paranoia. Convinced that communistic spies were infiltrating high-ranking positions in our society and feeding on our nation's fear during the Cold War, McCarthy held Senate hearings that were virtually government-sanctioned witch hunts. McCarthy's accusations in Senate hearings went on for more than 4 years before public opinion finally turned against him, and he was discredited and disavowed. Unfortunately, by then, many innocent Americans' careers and reputations lay in the dust and would never fully recover. The Cold War is so named because the Soviets and the United States never actually engaged in any armed conflict directly with each other, which is very fortunate as both superpowers had nuclear capabilities, and many agreed it could have world-devastating consequences. But there was one incident that did bring us nearly to the brink, and that was the Cuban Missile Crisis. No doubt how it started and why would be a contentious issue depending on whom you asked, but for the United States it began when President John F. Kennedy discovered Soviet Union Premier Nikita Khrushchev had placed nuclear missiles just 90 miles south of Florida in communistic Cuba. Needless to say, we were not happy about this imminent threat to our security and demanded he remove them immediately. Cuba claimed they were necessary because they were convinced that the United States was planning to invade the island nation, overthrow its dictator Fidel Castro, and establish capitalism. After intense negotiations, Kennedy and Khrushchev came to an agreement in which the United States promised to never invade Cuba and to remove our own missiles from the Soviet Union's neighboring nation of Turkey, and Khrushchev would immediately remove the missiles from Cuba. Armed conflict was averted, but many Americans were rightfully unsettled by how close to disaster we had come. For students to understand the term Iron Curtain and why it was necessary, they will need to understand the difference, at least in very broad and simple terms, between communism and capitalism, and why the United States is so opposed to communism. At first glance, communism seems only fair, and capitalism appears quite selfish, especially to children. In its purest sense, communism is the idea that everything is shared fairly, that the government owns everything and divides it up equally, thereby protecting us from our own greed. The problem is that governments can become corrupt and greedy too, and in a communistic system, the people have no way to prevent the government from abusing their power and distributing wealth unfairly. With capitalism, on the other hand, private individuals own nearly everything, and greed in pricing is controlled by the free market. Competition from other individuals and the freedom for people to choose to buy or not ensures that prices remain low and quality remains high. And herein lies perhaps the biggest problem with communism and why it eventually has failed in most nations that practiced it. There is no incentive to innovate. Why work hard to invent or develop a concept if you stand to gain nothing by it? Innovation requires time, hard work, and money up front, but the reward is the profits you will reap if successful. Once those profits are taken away and distributed to people who did not work as hard, it becomes difficult to justify innovating, and so the economy stagnates and dies, and so eventually does true communism. It is because of the inevitable stagnation of a communist economy that communistic nations must put up a metaphorical iron curtain around themselves, allowing no one to leave or defect, and no outsiders to come in. If you allow free passage across your borders, your top thinkers and innovators will want to leave and go to a nation where they can reap the benefits of their hard work and creativity. And if you allow outsiders to come in, they will sow the seeds of discontent by revealing the better standard of living in their home countries. Communistic regimes must keep their people ignorant of what life is like in other nations, for fear their own people will leave in droves. Because communistic Berlin was surrounded by non-communistic West Germany, it was quite easy for its citizens to defect, and so this was the one place where the metaphorical Iron Curtain became quite literal when Nikita Khrushchev approved the building of the wall around the city. That is all we have time for today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Here are some links to some helpful resources as well as those used in the creation of this screencast.